Really? The same background? Again? Yeah, that's because I'm too lazy to move my lights and camera. Let's get into why there are different Amish communities and different levels of Amish, meaning as some Amish are allowed to have this and others aren't, and all that. Some are stricter, some are less stricter. I will explain that all here. So let's roll the film. I'm going to use my community, the community I come from, as an example, and then we'll go from there. So in northern Indiana, Chippewa, Topeka, Goshen is a decent-sized Amish community. I think Ohio and Pennsylvania are I don't know which one of those is the largest, but those are bigger ones. But in Indiana, it's a decent-sized Amish community, and it's full of different church districts. Now, the church district is decided on where you live. So they take a map and they they draw out the lines of a church, and they say this is a church district. They draw another set, take out another section. It's another church district, and it's mapped out that way. So where you live depends on which church district you will attend, and that will depend on what you are allowed to have and not allowed to have. So let's zoom in a little bit on a church district, and we'll talk about that. So each church district has roughly 30 families in it. They each have a bench wagon that goes from house to house because they have church in their house. And they have a bishop, 2 ministers, and a deacon. So the bishop is the overseer, and he preaches. The 2 ministers just preach and support the bishop kind of in all the ugly, or in dealing with taking care of the group decisions, whatever. And then the deacon, who usually takes care of all other things like the money that comes in, the tithes and stuff like that. So the way it's supposed to work is that the whole church district as a whole decides on what they're allowed to have and what they aren't allowed to have. So, and what that looks like is, so they started off plain, but let's say somebody wanted to have riding lawnmowers. And what that would look like is this person who wants riding lawnmowers, he will go to the bishop and he'll say, hey, I think we should be allowed to have riding lawnmowers. Now, at this point, the bishop might say, no, that's just you're reaching too far there, buddy. Or he might, the following Sunday, he might bring it to the church. So after church is done, they ask all the non-members to leave, which is usually just kids. And then he brings it to the church and says, hey, somebody brought up that we should be allowed to have riding lawnmowers. We need to take a vote. So they would take a vote, men and women. And if everybody's okay with it, then everybody can have riding lawnmowers. If there's 2 or more votes against the idea of riding lawnmowers, then nobody can have it. They just nix it, right? And it can always be brought up at a later time, years down the road, whatever. So that's kind of how a church district decides on what they can have and can't have, right? So some had decided to have power lawnmowers. Some still had the old push, the reel mowers. Some were allowed to have spinners for their laundry. Some are not allowed to have that. Some were allowed to have steel wheels or rubber wheels on their buggies. Some were not allowed to have, they had to have steel wheels. But it all depends on what your group, your church district decides. And there is families who move around. They will not like the strictness of their church, so they will sell their house and move to a different district that might, say, allow rubber tires on their buggies. As a whole, with the exception of 2 churches in that huge community in northern Indiana, even though we had differences in what one church was allowed and the other one wasn't, they still fellowship together, right? So Amish only have church every other Sunday. And the in-between Sundays when you don't have church, the ministers and then some of the families will go visit other churches. Like we a lot of times went to our uncles or aunts who had churches. We would go over to and visit their church for that Sunday when it was at their house. So, but I think there was 2 districts close to where I live that didn't fellowship with us because they were way stricter. Like they still had, I don't think they had refrigeration. They still had to use the ice boxes and stuff like that. Now, but that was their choice. That's what they decided. Now, for the most part, I don't know. Our bishops, the bishops in the church I lived in, so I lived in a church and it got too big and they split it. And those 2 bishops were outstanding men. They weren't crooked. They were just very upstanding, good, solid men, right? But there might be the case where a bishop will take control and be more ruly, more strict, and not listen to his congregation as much, and not take what they have to say. He might just reject what ideas they have. I never lived in one of those, fortunately. And there is obviously the one in Ohio where the bishop was, I can't remember his name, but he was straight up evil. I don't know that I want to get into that, but he took advantage of his power, and he was punishing his members and sleeping with his members' wives and all that. He took full advantage of his power, and I think now he sits in jail. So, which is good. Some of you guys might remember that story. I believe it was in Ohio. So that can happen, but for the most part, I think in the Ohio, the Pennsylvania, the big communities, the more liberal, less conservative communities, that won't happen as much. It's more good. I don't know how to say it. So that's how we differed within our community. Now, if you go to Wisconsin or Michigan or sometimes in Missouri, those churches, those groups of Mennonite might have a couple church districts in that group living there are way stricter sometimes. Like their shunning is way stricter. Like if you get a car, you're kicked out and they won't let you come back in until you're Amish again and all that. And they might, some of those groups, they are so strict they're not allowed to live on a paved road. They have to live on dirt roads. They're not allowed to have running water. They might not even be allowed to have cabinets in their house, all that stuff. It's just, that's what they have decided. And I think those stricter communities think that communities like ours are too worldly, that we're, Amish people kind of view, they really focus on material things. And some people move to those smaller communities because they want a stricter life for their kids. They don't want their kids in public schools. They don't want their kids influenced by rumspringa with cars and alcohol. They don't want, they want a more stricter, more homely atmosphere for their kids. So they move to those communities, and that's just how they live. And it unfortunately, I think a lot of those smaller, stricter communities have a lot more problems than the less conservative ones, like the one I grew up in. But so that's how they decide what their lifestyles are like, what they're allowed to have, what they aren't allowed to have, is by each church district, right? So, and then sometimes those districts have tons of problems, fighting, whatever, amongst themselves, and they'll pull in bishops and ministers from other churches to help, or from other areas, other communities to help sort it out. And we're all human, so that's going to happen. But another thing is, so if you go to sale barns, if you go to sales auctions, if you come across Amish people, some of them will smell really bad. That's probably the ones that don't have running water in their house, and they take a bath maybe once a week. I do not know how they do that. I could not climb into a bed where I've slept in for 6 days. Yeah, that's just so disgusting to me. But they do it somehow. But in the and then the opposite of that is the community where I come from. They're some of the cleanest people I know. Like, yes, they work physically, they sweat, they smell at the end of the day, but they will shower every day. Their houses are spotless, and they're clean. So you have just all these varying aspects, and it seems like some of those stricter communities where they can't have running water and all that stuff, they tend to have more of a problem with drinking, even as adults. Not just in the Rumspringa period, but even after they're married, they have a problem with chewing, smoking, drinking, more so than the less conservative ones. And I don't know why that is. I'm not going to try to figure it out. We can always tell, as Amish people, we could always tell when we were out traveling or something and we saw another group of Amish people from somewhere in public. We could always tell they were from a different community. We maybe didn't know which one exactly, but we could always tell that they were from a completely different community. You could definitely tell the Pennsylvania ones, their head coverings were shaped kind of more like a heart, differently shaped. But in Ohio, they had the big Holmes County, Ohio community. Their girls always wore longer dresses than the Indiana ones. Maybe that's changed. That always changes with time. They just have their own little styles, their own little ways of doing things. But they all have that same core belief, their path to salvation. That is always very similar. It's just the way they go about life is a little bit different. So, it was definitely, so we had our main Indiana community, the big one, that everybody kind of fellowshiped together. And then we had what we called the Gnellarello. They were much stricter. It was 2 church districts. They were much stricter, and they weren't allowed to have rubber tires, rubber wheels. They had to have the steel tires steel wheels on their buggies. No refrigeration, stuff like that. And we just, we kind of looked down on them because they were just so much more. They were lower than us. And then there's communities out there, like in Michigan. There's communities that were even lower than that. And I'm not, one thing that I questioned that it didn't make sense to me was I would hear Amish people in my community talk about how those other lower communities, those more conservative communities, are putting their rules, those strict rules before, like that's more important to them than God. I actually heard people say that, and I was thinking, well, you're doing the same thing. You're just not as extreme. It just never made sense to me. There's a lot of things like that they didn't fit. And I think, that was God working in me, bringing that out, and which eventually moved me out of the community. If you haven't watched my testimony, go watch it. It's on this channel. Why I Left the Amish is what it's titled. I'll put it at the end of this video. It's like an hour and 20 minutes long, so someday when you have time, there you go. I want to plug Joseph Graber here. Joseph Graber and his wife, Joseph Graber was born Amish, then his family left, but he and his wife did a phenomenal 6-part series on Amish people. It's called Breaking the Silence, My Amish Story. Now, I'm sure a lot of you guys have watched it, but maybe it's the best, I think, the best film on Amish people. Go find it on Amazon. I think it's on YouTube now, at Vision Video on YouTube. It's definitely on Amazon. I own it on Amazon, and I have a hard copy of it. I really enjoyed it. He did a fantastic job. I highly encourage you to go watch it and support him if you can. So, that being said, I appreciate you guys watching. Keep us in your prayers. We're praying for you guys. If you have any more questions, put it in the comments below. Just If you like it, hit the like button, subscribe. We'll see you next time.